Good evening, and thank you very much for joining us at this event tonight. My name is Matteo Tomasina, and I am Security and Defense Officer at YPFP Brussels. This event is part of our ongoing NATO series, which is supported by the North Atlantic Treaty Organization's Public Diplomacy Division. At today's event, we are going to discuss space as the next frontier of international security and how NATO is adapting to this rapidly evolving environment. I would like to thank our speakers for being with us tonight. Thank you very much for finding the time to be with the YPFP and share your views with us. I have the pleasure to welcome Juliana Seuss from the Royal United Services Institute in London. Juliana is a research analyst and policy lead for space security at the Institute. Tonight, she will share her latest insight from the research on space policy. We also welcome Martinas Zapolskis from the NATO Defense Policy and Planning Division. Martinas is currently a space policy officer for NATO, and he has been involved with the development of the NATO space policy. Martina is also an academic researcher who has published on NATO transformation, environmental security, and military alliances. Juliana, Martinas, you may want to say a couple of words to our viewers before I go to the housekeeping rules for this event.
Just to say hello, everyone, and I'm looking forward to some exciting questions about space security.
Good evening, everyone. Good to be here. Thank you for having me on this, and looking forward for this discussion. Space is always an exciting topic to discuss.
Thank you very much, and thanks to our viewers for being with us tonight. So before we start with the event, I would just to share a couple of housekeeping rules. So first of all, each speaker will open the discussion with a short presentation of about 10 minutes on space security. We will then move to the Q&A session that will last about 30 minutes. We will use the chat function on YouTube, so please feel free to share questions at any time, and I will get back to those during the Q&A. When asking a question, please specify which speakers you would like to address the question to, and also please state your name and affiliation. We have live tweeting going on, so if you're a Twitter user, you can use the hashtag YPFP NATO series, and you can also tag our organization. Finally, at the end of the Q&A, we will ask our speakers to share some insight on careers advice for young professionals. So we encourage you to stay around until the end of the event. To kick off our discussion, I would like to start with a question for you, Juliana. So space is not a new security domain, as it has been at the center of great powers competitions since the Cold War. However, nowadays space is rapidly evolving and it's becoming more congested and competed, with new actors entering the space race. So what did your research uncover about space, and what are the major trends affecting security?
Thank you, Matteo. What are the major trends? I think one of the biggest trend we're seeing right now is the kind of emergence of new space, the fact that more and more actors are emerging in space, which I'll talk about in a minute with the hot topic that you already mentioned as contested, congested, and competed. Do you want me to go into the presentation right away?
Yes, please. I'm sharing your presentation now, so you should be able to see that on your screen.
Yes, perfect. Thank you. I can see it. So just to start off, I just wanted to thank YPFP for the invitation. I'm really glad to be here this evening. Hello to everyone watching. I'm really glad to see that people are still tuning into Zoom discussions and webinars as we are returning to a little bit more normality. And thank you to Matteo and the rest of the team for making this all run so smoothly. So space. When we're talking about space, what are we exactly talking about? Many policy documents increasingly go into the domain of space. It's become a hot topic globally, but what do we actually mean? What kind of technology are we even talking about? I'll delve into a little bit in this presentation just to cover the basics of what you need to know to follow the space debate. If we could go to the next slide, please. When we talk about space, which part of space are we even talking about? When we're talking about satellites, where exactly are they? So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Earth orbits, which is what we're mainly discussing when we talk about space, specifically national security in space. And the three orbits I'll be talking about is the lower Earth orbit, the medium Earth orbit, and geostationary orbit. What you can see in this slide is the lower Earth orbit. Its typical altitude is less than 1,000 kilometers, but it can also be as low as 160 kilometers above Earth. That may not sound like a lot, but just for comparison, a commercial plane flies at around 14 kilometers. There's not necessarily a set route for satellites in this orbit, and it is probably the best orbit that can be used for imaging just because it is closer to the Earth. It gives us much better resolution. Just so you know where exactly to place things, the ISS is in this orbit. And since it is so close to the Earth, it means that it travels much faster. So for example, the ISS travels around the Earth around 16 times a day, which does mean that if you have a satellite that's responsible for communications, they're usually part of a constellation just to be able to map further and constant coverage. Speaking about medium Earth orbit, which, as the name suggests, sits between lower Earth orbit and geostationary orbit, this is typically used for navigation satellites. Again, like LEO, it does not have a specific path around the Earth. And again, just for a little bit of navigation, the European Galileo system sits here. If we go to the next slide, we'll see the geostationary orbit. Satellites in this orbit circle the Earth in just under 24 hours. So this means it's a really good orbit for telecommunications and weather satellites, as they're traveling at the exact same, or not quite the exact same rate, but a similar rate speed as the Earth. And so they appear to be stationary. Because they're so far from the Earth, they cover a larger range. So technically, 3 are enough to provide coverage of the entire planet. If we're going to the next slide, we'll see the words that Matteo has already mentioned, and they're probably the most commonly associated with space. It's contested, congested, and competed. What do we mean by that? Since space is becoming a lot more accessible, more on that in a minute, more and more satellites are actually in space, which also means that we're producing much more space debris than we would have been around 10 or 20 years ago. The problem with space debris, and I'm sure the problem is obvious to most of us, is the fact that most or some of this space debris is simply too small to track. And even the smallest debris can do damage, which makes it an increasing problem for anyone settling satellites off into space. It's become a lot less expensive to go to Earth, which is a shift that we've seen since to go to space, sorry, which is a shift that we've seen since the 1990s, which means that it's become increasingly less of a state activity, and we can now see also commercial and private actors acting in space. And satellites can now be much smaller than we used to see them in space. So satellites as small as 10 grams are now in development. They're so-called femto satellites. And when we talk about new space, probably a term that you've seen, what we mean by that is this increasing commercialization of the space sector. Some of the big names in the space industry that you will have seen, of course, SpaceX, which was also picked by NASA to do the next moon landing with humans on board. Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic, I'm sure many of you have followed the billionaires setting off into space, even though some may argue that they didn't actually land in space, and they were at around 80 kilometers, and the international technical limit to be in space is 100 kilometers. Now, conflict in space, if we're going down to the national security route, it's not the newest concept. I mean, we saw anti-satellite weapons being developed and tested during the Cold War. But really, the first Gulf War was the turning point when we saw space being used as a tactical asset for troops on the ground. So that gives us a first idea of why space is so important. But also on the civil side, space is at this point essential to our everyday lives, whether it's GPS, that's a commonly one that's noted, but also bank transactions, communications via phone, etc. If our capabilities in space were to suddenly stop working, we would all notice pretty quickly that our lives would change. Also, the military is increasingly reliant on the space sector. It's used for intelligence, navigation, command and control, and new ISR capabilities generate even larger quantities of data, the ones that are in development right now. So again, we're increasingly reliant on space capabilities there. The obvious next question is, what about weapons in space? Could satellites be used as weapons? The short answer is that yes, they could. Even an innocent weather satellite could be turned into a weapon if it was hacked. We'll go into cyber attacks in a little more detail later. But if a satellite was hacked, you could do several things. For example, you could maneuver it so that it collides with another satellite, thereby damaging it. You could damage the actual satellite itself by moving its solar panels so that they get burned, or you could lower its orbit so that it burns up in the atmosphere. Just a few kind of small examples. Other ways to weaponize satellites will be discussed later. But then we ask, if this is all things that we could do, how are we preventing this from happening? What are the kind of international rules in place to prevent this? There is the Outer Space Treaty, which is kind of the landmark agreement in 1967. And prior to that, space was subject to general international law, which did not forbid the military use of space. So military users are permitted, subject to the observation of the rules of international law. And this treaty kind of set out the fundamental principles of activities in outer space. So, for example, you cannot place nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction, or install them on celestial bodies, or station them in outer space. There's further agreements such as the Moon Agreement from 1979. That is its nickname. It's got a much larger official name called the Agreement Concerning Activities of State on the Moon and Other Celestial Bodies. So you can see why Moon Agreement is the kind of preferred term. There's also the Liability Convention, which talks about questions of liability arising from activities in space and any potential resulting damage. Now, the problem with some of these treaties is certainly that they're quite broad. So, for example, in the Outer Space Treaty, neither peaceful use nor the word weapon are actually defined, which obviously, as you can imagine, leads to a lot of loopholes. And there's increasingly call for regulations in space and making them a lot more specific and taking into account the new technology that we've seen since the 60s. So there are a lot of drafts floating around at the moment, but the baseline at the moment is still the 1967 agreement. If we could go to the next slide, please. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about why an agreement as such would be helpful, talking about threats in space and space threats. So we need to distinguish, first of all, between environmental hazards, the technology is braving in space every day, and then the man-made threats in space. So natural hazards can include solar storms, such as the one that you can see here, and other solar weather phenomena, but also space debris, as we already mentioned, atmospheric drag, and the Van Allen radiation belt. Further challenges to anyone working to get any civil or military technology into space is the problem of perpetual motion and the significant energy needed for any movement. If we go to the next slide. But there's also man-made threats, ranging from technology specifically designed to target satellites, such as anti-satellite weapons. You can see one in this picture. There's also lasers that can dazzle sensors on satellites. Cyber attacks, we spoke about them earlier, that can derail a satellite. Equally, ground-based systems such as anti-ballistic missiles that could reach satellites in lower Earth orbit as their trajectory is predictable and could therefore hit their target there. So one of the biggest problems relating to threats in space is the kind of dual use problem, which means it is often quite difficult to tell what space technology is built for. I think most people, if you presented them with a fighter jet and a passenger plane, would be able to tell quite quickly which one was made for military use and which one was made for civil use. That's not really the case with a lot of the space technology that we can see now. And similarly, any satellite that is able to carry out rendezvous or proximity operations could potentially also use its capabilities to damage another satellite. So with that, with that scary thought in mind, we can see quite easily why space has become increasingly a domain of its own in policy papers rather than an auxiliary to land, air, and sea. And I will leave it on that note, and I look forward to Martina's comments.
Thank you very much, Juliana. That was very insightful. And I'm sure there will be many questions to you. But I would like now to go to Martina's to really focus on NATO. So it is no surprise, Martina's, that NATO is back to the forefront of, that space is back to the forefront of NATO's priorities. We know that in 2019, the Alliance declared space as an additional domain of operations. And in the 2030 agenda, space was defined as a new theater for geopolitical competition. So I would like to ask you, what is NATO's strategy for space, and which major decisions have been taken by the Alliance to build security in this domain? I will let you start, and then I will go to your presentation while you kick off. Thank you.
Thank you, Matteo, and good evening, everybody, again. And it is really my pleasure to participate in this event and share some thoughts from NATO perspective. I currently work in NATO International Staff in Defense Policy and Planning Division, and this division is dealing with a range of issues. Space is one of them, but as we talk more and more about the integrated approach to deterrence and defense, it is becoming more and more important. And I believe that Juliana's brief was an excellent overview of where we are, and we are indeed witnessing a fundamental transformation of space environment, and that is the case in security terms, in commercial terms, in innovation terms, and the technological developments are even outpacing the regulation that we currently have. So we currently have more than 4,000 satellites up there in the orbit. But in the upcoming years, and that's an important aspect to understand that change, in the upcoming years, thousands and thousands of new satellites will be launched, which raises a lot of questions on regulation, security, and many other aspects. And Juliana mentioned the 3C approach, congested, contested, and competitive. I also like to use from time to time the 4D approach, which is to say that space is becoming more diverse, disruptive, dangerous, and disordered. So when we talk about diverse, we clearly see that more and more nations and companies are becoming space actors. Disruptive in terms of technology and the launch prices, so new approaches and new business models are being developed that kind of transform the whole sector. Disordered, as Juliana mentioned, there is a lack of norms and regulations and treaties that regulate the whole thing. And dangerous, of course, of the wide range of counter space capabilities and threats that are out there. And I'm mentioning that because that's a very important context when we start thinking and start understanding what NATO as a security and defense alliance is doing in light of these challenges. So NATO, as well as individual allies, are directly affected by this changing security environment in space. And the NATO actually has reacted and responded quite resolutely in the space domain. And if we could move to the next slide, please, we will see that this response and this kind of movement of space being get higher and higher on NATO's agenda was very clear and very visible in NATO's recent summit in Brussels in June 2021. So for the first time, the summit communique approved by the leaders covered in quite a lot of detail NATO's efforts on space, and also for the first time, it included what we call a declaratory language on space. So specifically, allies have recognized that attacks to, from, and within space present a clear challenge to the security of the alliance. They also stated that the impact of such attacks could be as harmful as a conventional attack. And most importantly, that such attacks could lead to the invocation of Article 5, which is a collective defense clause of the alliance. So the decision, of course, would be taken by the North Atlantic Council on case-by-case basis, but this statement and the recognition of the applicability of the collective defense clause is a clear expression of the growing importance of space to the alliance. And I would say it's also a natural outcome of the extensive work that NATO has been doing on space in the last several years. Next slide, please. And we also have to take a step back here a little bit, because while we have a lot of very recent developments, we also have to understand and keep in mind that NATO is not starting from scratch. So allies have been dealing with space for decades, and among other things, space assets always were an integral part of missile defense mission, air and missile defense, for many reasons. For example, one of those reasons is that satellites actually detect missile launches. So missile defense mission is basically impossible without the early warning system and mechanism that is provided by satellites in the orbit. And NATO actually, as an organization, even had its own satellites from 1970s to 2010, which are defunct now. So they're not active satellites anymore, but they're actually still orbiting around Earth with NATO logo on them. And you can actually, if you go online, you can track them and see where exactly they are in almost real time. But of course, at the same time, we have to recognize that there was a fundamental change in recent years regarding NATO's approach to space. And in light of the changes in the security environment that we both have discussed already, NATO has re-energized its efforts on space. And 2019 could be seen as a turning point in this process, because this is when NATO agreed its new space policy. And also in London summit in 2019, NATO declared space as a fifth operational domain alongside land, air, maritime, and cyber. And if you follow this, you also definitely have noticed that in recent years, more and more allies are actually setting up their national space commands, national space force and centers to enable themselves to respond to these new emerging challenges. Next slide, please. So let me outline several key elements of NATO's approach to space. What is it? What are we talking about when we discuss NATO in space? First of all, it is important to understand that the alliance has recognized the changes of the space security environment. So as I mentioned before, space clearly is changing really fast in terms of technological, commercial, and security landscape, and that creates both opportunities, but it also creates new risks. And some states clearly are developing and testing a wide range of kinetic and non-kinetic counter space capabilities and are acting irresponsibly in space. And while the media likes to focus, I would say, on anti-satellite missiles and the tests, we also have a lot of other anti-satellite systems and weapons that have the ability to do jamming, spoofing, dazzling, lasing, hacking, electromagnetic pulse. There are many vulnerabilities of the satellites out there that can be exploited. So when we think about the importance of the services that are provided through satellites, we have to understand that threat environment. We have to understand the risks that are out there. Secondly, and that's a very important aspect, NATO recognizes, and NATO's policy recognizes and talks on that in detail, that space is increasingly essential for NATO's deterrence and defense. And satellites and the information and the services provided through them are absolutely critical to support NATO's operations, missions, and activities. And this reliance exists in many different aspects. So, for example, we can take navigation, which is the most common one. We can take intelligence and surveillance, tracking forces, both your own or opponent's forces, command and control, communications, targeting, etc. So basically all NATO military operations are heavily dependent on the information delivered from and through space, through the satellites. So for example, Alliance's new drone fleet, Alliance Ground Surveillance Program, is controlled and passes information through satellites. So without actively working and functioning satellites, we would not be able to run that. And in relation to that, of course, it is supporting decision-making, because through imagery that we get through satellites, through early warning that we get through satellites, through situational awareness and attribution that are enabled by the space services, we can make better decisions. So definitely NATO often relies on various space products in its decision-making process. We also allies have identified certain principles that kind of govern and define NATO's approach to space. And one of the key aspects here, and it is very important to understand when talking about the alliance, is that NATO is not planning to develop its own satellites. So NATO's approach to space relies on national space assets and on national space data products and services. In other words, allies maintain full sovereignty over their space assets, but NATO works as a kind of a hub, as a forum to make sure that they're all integrated and they can be plugged in for NATO's purposes and be used in operations, missions, and activities as required. So that's a critical element of NATO's approach to space. And of course, as said many times by the Secretary General and also expressed at the recent summit, I mean, NATO's approach is in line and fully respects international law, and there is no intention to weaponize space or put weapons into space or act against international law. And finally, what's also very important, and I would say that's a strong point, that's a strength that the alliance can take advantage, and definitely is taking advantage of, is being a forum for consultations and kind of interoperability. So NATO, you could say, is a natural platform to bring allies together, to facilitate coordination of activities and to exchange information, including political consultations and also technical side of interoperability of allied space assets, etc. Next slide, please. And this is my last slide. So what's next? When we talk about NATO's space agenda in light of the recent summit, these are the issues that are important in further implementation in terms of next steps in our roadmap. First of all, we continue to stand up the NATO Space Center. So the decision was taken last year by the defense ministers to establish a NATO Space Center at Allied Air Command in Ramstein, Germany. And this is a critical element of the whole piece of NATO's approach to space, because the center will connect to national space entities and across the NATO command structure. So the center will become a kind of focal point and a hub to ensure that NATO's access to allied space products and services is ensured in support to NATO's operations and missions. So this, I would say, is our priority for the upcoming months and even years as the Space Center is being stand up and reaches out to allied national space entities. The second important aspect is the inter-domain approach. So other domains such as land, maritime, or air, and even cyber to some extent, are very much dependent on space. So it is critical to ensure that space is utilized as a critical enabling domain to ensure effective deterrence and defense posture, including the implementation of NATO's military concepts and further military adaptation. So it's a part of NATO's broader adaptation of its deterrence and defense. And again, in this case, we have to understand that every single military unit is heavily dependent on space. So soldiers often use communication and communicate through satellite communications, use navigation. Aircraft and military aviation is critically dependent on space in terms of meteorological information, navigation, weapon system control, et cetera, et cetera. So it's everywhere, and it really affects how do we operate, plan operations and missions, talk to each other, integrate different forces, et cetera. Third aspect, kind of improving our knowledge about space and making sure that that different allies are able to work together is training and exercises. So that's a critical element of our current activities, and also it's related to innovation efforts. So emerging technologies are currently transforming the space domain, and NATO will take advantage of these developments to maintain its technological edge. And one of priorities also is continuing improvement of space domain awareness, which is critical to better understand threats and have a good understanding of the situation in space. Fourth, NATO remains an important platform to coordinate positions on the legal aspects as well as responsible behavior in space. Especially with regard to the ongoing process in the United Nations on the responsible behavior in space. And perhaps we can discuss that further in the Q&A session. And finally, the decision was made during the recent NATO summit that by the next summit in June 2022 in Madrid, NATO will have to prepare and approve at that summit a new strategic concept, which is a key NATO document guiding its defining its core tasks and guiding its approach towards the current security environment. So of course, this is a critical process for the upcoming months, and clearly it will have to reflect space in that document as well. So this is something that will be discussed, and we're looking forward for that for the upcoming months. So to summarize, I would say we have a clear roadmap and quite a busy schedule for 2022 and beyond. And with that, I conclude my briefing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martinas. It was really insightful, really clear on the importance of space for military capabilities, and in explaining the effort that the Alliance is doing to facilitate national cooperation in this domain. I see that we already have some questions from our audience. So I would like to start with the first one, which is for you, Juliana. So the question is from Elisa at YPFP. So Juliana, you talked a lot about the private sector's role in space. So Elisa would like to know how the government and the private sector could cooperate together in this domain. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Elisa, for the question. It is a really important one. And specifically in the UK National Space Strategy that was published on the 27th, we saw that the private sector featured here quite heavily, speaking about future launches and exactly how industry and government can work together and cooperate on this. Also, as I already mentioned, SpaceX being quite heavily involved in NASA operations and being tasked with the newest, with the moon landing in the future under the Artemis project. So I think we will see increasing cooperation in this domain. It's become a lot less of a, purely state-based activity, and we've seen industry make huge strides in this. So for states to completely ignore industry, I think would be very unproductive. And clearly this has been picked up by most governments who are, providing more funding and making it easier for the space industry to raise funds and to go where they want to go in the coming years. So increasing cooperation, much more so than we saw initially in the first space race, for example. and we'll see much more commercial actors prop up in this sector for sure.
Thank you very much, Juliana. Before we go to the next question, I would like to ask Martinas, what is your take on this topic of cooperation with the private sector? Thank you.
That is absolutely essential, and I think that, as we both have mentioned before, the technology drive and the transformation that we see right now by the private sector is the cause of partly in huge amount is the cause of this transformation that we are observing. So I think SpaceX flying to the International Space Station was a great example of that, which really is a game changer, and the cost, the reduced cost as a result of reusable boosters that pushed by SpaceX. I mean, that's fundamental. But there is just a kind of most visible example, but there are many others in terms of small companies that are doing a lot of research and development in terms of satellite communications, in terms of observation of Earth observations. So, for example, climate change related monitoring of Earth and oceans, etc. There are many applications that are stemming from the private sector. Looking at that more from the alliance, from NATO perspective, it's a bit more tricky, because if you talk about security and defense, you have to make sure that whatever service that you use, it has to be kind of reliable also in certain more kind of difficult and complicated scenarios, including certain contingencies. So that's tricky, but I think this link is unavoidable, and we already do that. So, for example, NATO has a contract regarding satellite communication. So NATO has decided to invest over 1 billion euros to procure satellite communication services for the period up to 2034. And that is done through certain allies, but then again, those allies turn to specific companies that then provide that capacity. So it is essential, and I think it will define the future in space for the upcoming years.
Yeah, for sure. That's a very interesting development indeed. And thank you very much, Martinas. So we also have a question from Maria from YPFP. So Maria would like to ask to you, Martinas, what do you think about the role of Article 5 and space? And can NATO put a red line between Article 5 and non-Article 5 situations in the space domain? The floor is yours.
Well, as I mentioned in my brief, the latest summit, NATO summit at Brussels, basically for the first time provided declaratory language regarding the invocation of Article 5 and the invocation of collective defense clause in space. And the language, if you read the article, paragraph 33, if I remember correctly, of the Brussels summit communication, it's very clear. I mean, it clearly says that attacks to, from, or within space present a clear challenge to the security of the alliance. It clearly says that the impact of such attacks could be as harmful as a conventional attack. And I think this goes back to something that Juliana has mentioned. When we think about day without space, the consequences would be absolutely enormous in terms of paralysis and dysfunctioning of our banking system, the banking transactions, the stock markets, the electricity, large-scale electricity grids. None of that would be able to work, which would cause global disruption. So what kind of NATO is doing is recognizing that we're talking about an important issue here, and that the impact of attacks on space objects could be as harmful as conventional attack. And most importantly, it could lead to the invocation of Article 5. But at the same time, as we have done from the alliance perspective previously with hybrid challenges and hybrid threats, as well as cyber, there is a certain ambiguity, of course, that's left there. So we don't go into the details in terms of defining in every single circumstance and situations, because that would defy the actual purpose. I mean, to make that message work, you have to leave it somewhat ambiguous. So I think that the message is loud and clear, and it kind of it is a natural expression of the importance of the issue, and a very clear expression that allies do take that seriously.
Thank you very much, Martinas. I would like to ask the follow-up question to Juliana. So, Juliana, do you think that it will be easy for NATO to decide on an Article 5 situation in space?
That is a very good question. I think the question about Article 5 is sort of the identifying question. It's the big question about space domain and NATO. And there's further questions about accountability and attribution in space. As you already said, would a decision be easy? I think realistically, no, because quite a lot of the time, if we're speaking about a non-kinetic attack, so if it's electronic, if it's via, if it's jamming or spoofing, it can quite often be really hard to track who was behind the attack. Or it can also simply be indistinguishable from regular interference or accidental jamming, which also happens all the time. So it can be really hard to actually pinpoint and attribute the attack if there was an attack, or if it's just a regular occurrence. So unless we're seeing a kinetic attack that is quite clearly an attack, then I think the questions are, how can we find out who is behind this? So it's one of the big questions about the space domain in general. Much like we had the debate around cyber around 10 years ago, how will we ever know where certain cyber attacks are coming from? And we're going to have those same debates about space. So I think it's the attribution problem that will be defining that question, and that will kind of respond to that properly to say, will it be difficult to reach that decision? I think unless it's a very clear and kinetic attack that we're able to track the perpetrator, I think it will be very difficult.
And I would add to that, and this is also recognized in the summit communique, that the decision on that would be taken by the North Atlantic Council, by the consensus of all allies, on a case-by-case basis, of course, assessing the situation in very specific terms, and making sure that we are able to evaluate and kind of assess all aspects of that. But it also reinforces, I think, this debate kind of reinforces the notion of the importance of the space situational awareness. So we have to make sure that we are able to better understand of what's happening in space, including the threat environment. But it's just part of it. So it's also related to space traffic management, being able to observe the space objects, how they move. I mean, what are the potential threats, to be able to track them, to share information among different entities, both government and commercial entities. And it's also related with issues of a kind of resilience and redundancy. So resilience is one important aspect, because it's in this case national responsibility to make sure that their satellites, in some cases, if you put up a new satellite to space, you have to make sure that it is resilient and it's able to withstand some forms of those attacks. So, for example, the new satellites that are being launched, I mean, they are much better able to withstand the jamming, spoofing, and certain other counter space techniques. But it's also about the redundancy, because it's very important to make sure that if you somehow make one part of the whole space allied, let's say, space architecture ineffective, that others then can kind of supplement for that and be plugged into the overall. So the different systems have to work together, and that also is a message, I think, to the potential adversary, that there might be you will not achieve much by trying to attack a satellite, I mean, in a non-kinetic way, because I mean there is a redundancy satellite that will simply take his place and do the task for it.
Indeed, and thank you very much, Martinas, for the follow-up on this question. So I see that Elisa has a second question, but I will go to the next one, as I want to give everybody the opportunity to ask their question. So the next question is from Jordan Gochev, and is asking whether NATO is cooperating with the EU, for example, with the EU Satellite Center or the Copernicus program. And I would like to ask this question to both, and maybe Juliana, you can go first.
I was just about to say, I think Martinez is best placed to start on that question. Because obviously the EU has already also been talking about space a lot more, but also we need to, I think, take into account the difference between the two organizations. Also, we have the European Space Agency that the UK has said they'll work with a lot more, but obviously ESA is firmly placed in the kind of civil architecture in space rather than on the defense side. So I think when it comes to defense, NATO and the European Union, it's an interesting subject when and how their cooperation will be seen, and how their strategies will kind of fit together in the coming years, as you know, as NATO published this strategy in 2019, and how the EU will kind of respond to that, and how, you know, European nations have also been publishing their strategies and been much more vocal about space on an individual basis. I think it'll be really interesting to see how cooperation will pan out in practical terms, and it'd be really interesting to hear how Martinez has thought about this.
Yeah, so let me start by saying that the EU definitely is a very important space actor, and EU is very closely engaged in space from multiple perspectives. So it is very important for us really to follow that process and to understand, to ensure that we have the necessary awareness of its activities and efforts. So, for example, the 2016 EU space policy published by the Commission addressed a really wide range of challenges and the use of space in tackling them. So they talk about fighting climate change, they talk about stimulating technological innovation, they talk about providing socioeconomic benefits to citizens. And as you know, EU is a very different space actor from this respect, because it manages and it owns large space projects and actually satellite constellations. So, for example, Galileo is a EU's global navigation system, which is comparable to the GPS, the American global positioning system. EU also has Copernicus, which is an Earth observation program. So satellites flying in a low Earth orbit and taking pictures, at the same time having super advanced sensors to measure all kinds of meteorological, environmental data, oceans, and then you name it. So EU is kind of is directly involved in that as an independent and autonomous space actor. And earlier this year, EU approved actually a space program up to 2027 with securing more than 14 billion euros for that, which is quite a substantial amount of money, showing, I think, this high level of ambition. At the same time, as Juliana said, we have to understand that the EU is focused more on the commercial kind of aspects and focused on those programs that they already have and are providing certain services, rather than deterrence and defense related aspects. And we also have to understand that many allies are also EU members. So there is an overlapping membership there, and allies being the EU members, they are already able to use and they already actively participate in various EU space structures. And there are many of them, because many different EU entities, including European External Action Service, the EU Commission, European Space Agency, and the Satellite Center. I mean, there are many different space entities from the EU side which are involved in that. So I would say that there's definitely a potential for closer engagement and cooperation, and we have to move towards that. We have to gradually explore the potential areas for that cooperation and better understand each other's efforts and make sure that we utilize this potential.
Yeah, thank you very much, Martinez, and very positive message on the cooperation between NATO and the EU. I will combine the next two questions together. So Brent and Algis, they are both asking whether we should be concerned by orbital activities of countries like Russia and China. So is there a potential for an arms race in space? So I would like to ask this question to Martinez first, and then Juliana.
Well, My answer is yes. We should be concerned. We are concerned, and many allies actually on different occasions have expressed concern on very specific space events when satellites of some other countries have acted kind of irresponsibly in a dangerous way, causing trouble without informing about that activity, etc. We allies, including the United States, have expressed concerns about the recent Russian anti-satellite missile tests that take place quite regularly, and these are disturbing. I think it shows these examples. There are many others. Show a pattern of a disturbing pattern of kind of irresponsible behavior. But I wouldn't that much connect that to the arms race. I would more connect that to the process, including the one that is currently ongoing at the United States Nations, to make sure that we promote responsible behavior in space and that we are able to define certain aspects of behavior in space which are deemed as irresponsible and which, you know, then the international community can push back on. So if someone tests a missile and shoots down a satellite, generating a huge amount of debris, which has happened in 2007 when China did that, that's a huge problem for everybody, because that can affect other satellites, that pollutes the space environment, that really has a lot of negative consequences. So this is just I think the low-hanging fruit is an easy the kind of behavior it's easy to identify and condemn, but there are many others. So that's why those importance at the United Nations are very important, and we have to make sure that we are able to support, and that also from the NATO perspective, because allies are involved in those discussions, so they have to coordinate their positions, they have to exchange information on that, etc. But essentially, it's very important to be able to kind of call out that behavior. So if something behaves irresponsibly, we have to be able to push back on it from the international community perspective and say that, you know, this is not the way to move on.
I think Martinez has kind of summed that up very nicely already. I mean, yeah, as Martinez already said, there's plenty of developments that you know have caused concern. I think one of the more prominent ones was China's launch of development of Shijian-17, which is a satellite that has a robotic arm that can be used to grapple satellites, which could obviously be used to repair their own satellites. But equally, if you can grapple your own satellite, that means you could also grapple someone else's satellite. And that also kind of feeds into the discussion about dual-use technology that we touched upon earlier. I think ultimately this highlights the fact that space is an entirely new domain that we're just now coming to terms with and getting to grips with, and we're seeing you know, increasingly new and sometimes futuristic sounding weapons that are being experimented with in this space, which I think makes it even more important to, you know, talk about the future of responsible behaviors in the UN. And I think, as that resolution already touches on, I think what we really need is a kind of forum of transparency and cooperation in space. I think transparency is going to be a key word in these discussions in the coming years, to be able to tell where nations are currently standing with their developments, where we're seeing new technologies crop up and what they're used for. And yeah, I think we're still at an early stage with this, especially with the Responsible Behaviors Forum. So I think we can only sit back and wait and see. But as Martina said, obviously there's plenty to be worried about in the meantime until we have an agreement.
Yeah, thank you very much, Martinez and Juliana. So the time is running short. However, I would like to ask a last question from the audience. So this is about a topic that you briefly mentioned, Juliana. So how are space debris compromising the space environment for NATO? And what is NATO doing to protect its assets and capabilities from a degraded space environment? So I would like to ask your take, Martinas, on this.
So shortly on space debris, I mean, that's definitely an issue and an emerging issue. I think I've seen one of the latest kind of assessment is that approximately 34,000 pieces of debris larger than 10 centimeters are flying around, and almost 900,000 small elements of debris from 1 centimeter to 10 centimeters. So that you can imagine the magnitude of it. But as far as NATO and the degraded space environment, as I mentioned, I think it's very important to understand one of the principles that I've mentioned in my presentation. That is that NATO does not have its own satellites. So allies own their satellites, and essentially allies, different nations, are responsible for the protection of those satellites, making sure that they're robust enough to withstand some of the threats that are out there. However, the added value of the alliance certainly is related to the kind of being a clearinghouse to exchange best practices, to share information of that, to ensure that we have a coordinated approach, and to even talk about the technical standards, about the interoperability, about what works, what really doesn't work in terms of, for example, of hacking withstanding the potential hacking of a satellite or a cyber attack, etc. So it provides a very important forum and a platform to make sure that we integrate all that knowledge on making sure that we are as resilient in space as possible.
Yeah, thank you very much, Martinas. I see, Juliana, that you also have a point on this, so the floor is yours.
Yes, just very briefly. I know we talked about space debris a little bit already, and as Martinas, I think quite terrifyingly outlined the magnitude of the problem in terms of just how much is already out there. Just to kind of give it a little bit more context, I think also one of the big problems with space debris is that it does grow. Even if you only have in space what you already have, these elements can kind of clump together and build an even bigger piece of space debris that can then in turn knock out another satellite. So the problem is growing even without us pumping more technologies into space. I think an element where NATO could come in, and generally any kind of community that comes together to talk about space and coordinate on space, is of course, potentially limiting the number of constellations that need to be put into space if you can coordinate with your allies and cooperate on those. But also, I think we've already seen quite a lot of developments in order to decrease the amount of space debris that we're producing. For example, one idea has been to place satellites into very low Earth orbit, which would then allow any satellites that become defunct to kind of flop down into the atmosphere and burn up, so you don't have that immediate space debris problem in orbit. That could of course lead to other problems further down the line, but that is one idea. We've also seen anti-satellite weaponry that is now being developed that will lead to less space debris. So it's definitely been picked up as an issue, so that we're even seeing it in the kind of weapon developments that this is something that is tackled.
Okay, thank you very much, Juliana. So this is a very interesting topic that would definitely warrant a greater discussion. However, unfortunately, we need to conclude tonight's discussion at this point. But before we go, I would like to ask to both of you whether you can give some advice to our young professional audience for a career in international affairs. So I would like you, Martinas, to go first.
Thank you, Matteo. So, yeah, well, I struggled to come up with a good advice a little bit, but one thing that I would probably suggest is to kind of be a little bit more critical and selective on which advice do you actually take on board. So I think we all kind of run into people that are very keen to advise us quite often, and that somehow know very well what is the good path, what is not a good path, what will work, and especially what will not work. So it's I think it's an emerging trend. People kind of knowing what's better for others. So my advice is to, when you hear advice about your own career choices and paths that you might want to take, I would advise you to somehow check whether that person who is giving the advice is kind of genuinely happy with his own choices and his own career and his own status quo. And you'll notice that usually it's not really the case, that people who are not really happy, and I think that they have made wrong choices, they are somehow keen to give advice to others. So I would offer this as an unconventional advice in your future path.
Yeah, very good. That's indeed a very good advice. Juliana, the floor is yours.
I think first of all, I would just like to say I'm going to take on that advice, Martinez. I think that is a very good point. So usually when someone asks me about career advice, I would say network, but I feel like that is a bit overdue considering people are gathering here with YPFP. I think networking is already on everyone's mind and agenda. So something I would just like to put out there is to stay curious and to keep reading and to keep engaging with things. I studied politics, international relations. I did not see myself going into the technicalities of space security when I first studied. It's something I came across, and it's a hugely fascinating topic, but I wouldn't say that when I set out to do my undergrad, that was something I immediately had in mind. So keep an open mind on the fascinating new topics that are out there, and stay curious, and don't be afraid to tackle new themes.
That's very good advice as well, Juliana. So let me thank you both for being with us tonight and for sharing your experience and expertise with us. And of course, also thank you to our viewers, and a special thanks to the NATO PDD for sponsoring this event. Before we close, I have a few announcements to make. So our next discussion will be about peace mediation and climate crisis, and it will take place on the 26th of October. One day after, on the 27th, we will have our next NATO event, which will be about NATO's counterterrorism capabilities. Of course, we also have a lot of other exciting events coming up. So please keep an eye on our newsletter, on our social media, to make sure you don't miss anything. We are very much looking forward to welcoming you online at our events. Also, I would like to offer a special discount for our non-members that joined tonight. So please visit our membership page on the website and select the Brussels YPFP branch to take advantage of this discount today. We also give you the opportunity to share your feedback on this event. You will be able to do so through the survey link at the chat box. It's very important that you provide your feedback so that we can continue to host events like this one for the next years as well. Once again, thanks a lot, everybody, for joining us tonight. Thanks to our speakers. Have a nice evening, and hope to see you the next time.